you guys hear me? That's really loud. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about hostility, impulsivity, and social processes in BPD today. But to just start out, I'm going to go over the diagnostic criteria for BPD, so we're all on the same page, somewhat about the diagnosis in terms of DSM-4. I think he's going back there. Hold on a second. So BPD is a pervasive pattern of relationship. Can we turn that off? That microphone?
Not really.
Okay, I'll just stay away from it then. I'll stay really far back. A pervasive pattern of relationship self-image and affective instability and marked impulsivity indicated by 5 or more of the following criteria, which I'm sure that all of us have probably seen before. We have a great variability in criteria, but there are certain themes. I'm going to focus on the symptom themes of BPD today, the symptom profile of unstable relationships, affective dysregulation, impulsivity, and aggression. So I think that's a way that we can kind of make it more succinct when we're talking about the phenomenology of BPD. And what I've tended to notice in my research, and what probably many clinicians and individuals in the audience might notice about the phenomenology of this disorder, is that all of these symptoms seem to feed back into one another and influence each other, particularly with regards to unstable relationships and the affective dysregulation, impulsivity, and aggression. And that's where I'm going to go with my talk today and show you some evidence on this. So how common is BPD? Well, in community studies, it's typically 1 to 2%, although some recent studies are showing that it might be as prevalent as 6%. A lot of this has to do with how you assess it, what criteria you focus on. In clinical studies, it's about 10% of outpatients that are showing up seeking treatment and 20% of inpatients. So we see an increasing prevalence rate. But when we look in forensic settings, now there's a lot of variability, but a fairly recent study shows that 25 to 50% in forensic settings could meet criteria for BPD. That's a huge jump in prevalence. And it leaves a lot of questions about why is there an increased prevalence in forensic settings. Now, there are some inconsistencies in what this prevalence rate is, and some of these things have to do with gender, with the crimes. So if you're looking at substance use-related crimes, or if the setting is specifically for that, then it tends to increase. If you're looking at a psychiatric inpatient setting that's forensic, it tends to increase. And then other methodological issues. But certainly we can say that its increased prevalence rate is present in forensic settings, and that is one of the reasons that we're going to look at the kind of the interactions of the symptoms and legal involvement today. I'd like to talk about maybe some possibilities about why is there a difference in prevalence. So if we go back and look at that symptom profile, I'm going to keep coming back to this slide, so you'll see this a lot. We're going to focus on the entire conference today on the impulsivity and aggression. But I don't think those are two completely unrelated to the other 2 symptoms that you see there. And I'm going to show you some evidence why. BPD and impulsive aggression are highly related. It's been proposed as a possible phenotype, so the kind of trait expression of borderline personality disorder. And these 2 traits of aggression and impulsivity are common traits underlying all cluster BPD. So that's narcissism, histrionic, borderline, and antisocial. So that cluster of personality disorders, they all seem to be somewhat higher on those 2 traits. But borderline personality disorder is distinguished from the other 3 by its very high rate of impulsivity. So relative to those other 3 disorders, individuals with borderline personality disorder have very high impulsivity. So that might be a distinguishing characteristic. But either way, impulsive aggression seems to be rather prevalent in individuals with this disorder. So what is impulsive aggression? Well, there's different conceptualizations of it, but one possibility is that it's It's a reactive aggression. It's situation-dependent displays of aggressive behavior that are impulsive, unpredictable. They are characterized by hostility and anger. They're carried out without goals. They're a kind of hair trigger. It's that emotion dysregulation in the moment. And they're often associated with many maladaptive behaviors. And it also seems that perceptions of context and interpersonal interactions are biased towards interpretations of threat or hostility. At least that's how it's described in the literature. What are the neural mechanisms then that are associated with this? The next talk is going to talk much more in depth about these, but some possible systems that relate to some of the areas I'm going to talk about are those systems that support the experience of and expression of aggressive impulses, systems that evaluate the consequences, but also interpersonal cues. So that's particularly relevant. So notice that the social, the interpersonal is coming in even with something that seems very, very trait and behavior focused. And systems that are involved in modifying or suppressing emotions and other impulsive urges. So we keep saying impulsive aggression. So is it impulsivity, or is it aggression, or is it both? Well, studies that have, there hasn't been much work done on this, but studies that have examined it suggest that trait impulsivity and aggression, those are two separate constructs, but it's the overlap of those two constructs that seem to be related to this construct of impulsive aggression. It's the reactive anger or perhaps hostility is the common thread, and that this reactive anger is highly associated with emotion dysregulation. And that's important because emotion dysregulation disorder, because that's the focus of many treatments. So that seems to be the theme. So if we go back to the symptoms, we're now talking about at least 3 of the 4 symptoms. Right? So impulsive aggression seems to be encompassing at least 3 of the 4 main symptom profiles in BPD. So maybe though, maybe that's what is leading to these outcomes, the increased prevalence in legal involvement. We have the symptom profile, and we know from other research that that symptom profile is associated with some really negative consequences for functional outcomes. There's functional impairment, unstable employment, increased prevalence of substance use disorders. And maybe it's those functional outcomes that are leading to the increased rates of legal involvement. Because if we think about them, the idea that someone is engaging in substance use makes it more likely that they'll be involved in the criminal system. The idea that individuals might be, have more functional impairment might make it more likely. We don't know. So does research find associations between BPD symptoms and legal involvement? Well, there is some research, some very, very recent research, that suggests that if you look within individuals that are involved with the legal system somehow, so this was a massive study looking at everyone that's involved, the number of BPD symptoms are correlated with the number of illegal behaviors. But there's something very important about that, in that the types of illegal behaviors are not all types of illegal behaviors. It was very clear the types of illegal behaviors that were associated in the study. And they were aggravated assault, disorderly conduct, and substance-related violations. So if we go back to that slide I just showed you, maybe it is that it's the functional outcomes that are relating to the legal involvement. And then another study from colleagues here at Yale showed that association between BPD symptoms and involvement with DCF. But that was mediated by interpersonal, like the unstable relationship symptoms. That's important. So maybe it's not just completely about the impulsivity or the substance use. Maybe it's something about the interpersonal. So the question then becomes, is BPD a risk factor for violence or criminal behaviors or legal involvement? Given these studies, is that what we're saying here? And I want to be very clear that we're not saying that. It's not. A very recent review of the literature showed that BPD, when you look at individuals in the general population, you say an individual with a BPD diagnosis versus an individual without a BPD diagnosis. Does the individual with the diagnosis have an increased risk for violent aggression relative to those that do not? And the answer is no, they do not. So when we're looking at the general population, it's not that these individuals are at greater risk for engaging in criminal behaviors. So that doesn't explain it. It's not simply the diagnosis. So maybe there are individual differences that are putting patients with BPD more at risk for legal involvement. And in this particular study, it was co-occurring antisocial PD diagnosis. That personality disorder diagnosis is highly prevalent in the forensic system, so that makes a lot of sense. And also a history of child maltreatment. But also maybe once in the legal system, the reason that prevalence rates are so salient are because something about individuals with the disorder, once they're in the system, might have more difficulties in the system. And so it becomes, their diagnosis becomes salient because it's causing issues there. So I want to make sure that we avoid adding stigma. We're not saying that individuals with this diagnosis are more likely to be involved with legal or crime or aggressive behaviors that result in them going to jail. But we do need to determine what individual differences are there that are associated with these outcomes, and why is this prevalence rate increasing, and what can we do once those individuals are in there to help them better, to use that as an opportunity to help them. So if we go back to that symptom profile of borderline personality disorder, I was saying that we've talked about all three, but maybe the unstable relationships are something that we need to look at further. Maybe impulsivity is associated with a specific type of unstable relationship or specific type of social process that might be occurring in certain individuals, and then this is resulting in it. And certainly the name impulsive aggression implies, oh, maybe there are certain individuals that are more aggressive, and that's what's causing them to get involved in the system. And we know that interpersonal functioning in BPD is a key aspect of it. It relates to many domains of functioning, work, family, friends, but we aren't quite sure yet what the issues are. It's really hard to figure out, and we were talking actually before the conference about what exactly is it. It's not something we've been very good at being able to identify, at least cross-sectionally. But it could be that their social tendencies are different, social traits, and maybe their social traits are fundamentally different in individuals with borderline personality disorder. Maybe it's social perceptions or the processing of interactions are different. Maybe it's social reactions that are different. We're not quite sure. But we can look at this to find out, how do impulsivity and aggression relate to interpersonal functioning? And is there a prototypical interpersonal style in patients with BPD? So we can look, how might the unstable relationships be manifested in individuals with this diagnosis? So to answer that, I'm going to take kind of a sidestep and tell you a little bit about one of my favorite theories, interpersonal theory, which really offers a nice way to understand heterogeneity in patient populations, identify subgroups. I'm sure that many of us have worked with patients with depression. And when you have a patient with depression come in, they could interact with you in many, many different ways, right? They don't all look the same. I mean, maybe some of them are more withdrawn, but in fact, they're all different social processes manifested in an individual with depression. And there are ways to look at that and then look at how those individual differences in social processes might be making the disorder worse for some people. Why do some individuals with depression not recover from depression? Why do some individuals with depression get worse with some treatments but get better with others? And other research has found that interpersonal factors can predict a lot of those changes. This has been done with anxiety disorders. It's starting to be done with personality disorders. And differences in the interpersonal traits predict both social behavior and perceptions, but they also are predicting treatment and functional outcomes. So in a study that was recently published with one of my collaborators, Nicole Kane, who's you might have met upstairs, she looked at this in depressed patients and found that a specific interpersonal style was associated with worse outcomes over 10 years. It was not everyone. And in fact, some individuals looked much better. They got better very quickly with their depression, even though they all had equivalent depression. So maybe this can inform our understanding of what's going on, what kind of heterogeneity is present with individuals with borderline personality disorder, and maybe this can help us understand how do certain individuals with BPD end up in the forensic setting. So how do we describe social processes? So I'm talking about these different social processes. I'm saying people with depression have different social processes than other people with depression. So what's the best way for us to describe them? And I have a preference for 2 dimensions. And the reason I use these 2 dimensions is that they were originally derived from clinical work, from coding tons and tons of therapy interactions and group therapy interactions in the 50s. But actually, if you look across clinical, social, developmental, neurobiological research, you'll find that they're kind of talking about these 2 dimensions across all these different areas of research. They might use different names, but if you read about it and you read what they're describing, they sound very similar. And we could say, one dimension is affiliation hostility, or being affiliative and wanting to connect with others, and really not being into that. That's not my thing. And the other dimension is dominance to submissiveness. How dominant, assertive are you in any given situation versus how much do you kind of say, all right, I'll let everyone else take control here. So those 2 dimensions are the ones that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to illustrate how we might be able to describe our patients or each other on these dimensions. So if we had one individual, let's say person A, and person A is relatively unaffiliative. We could say that they're colder. They don't really approach other people. They kind of keep their distance. And in terms of dominance, we could say that person A is also rather submissive. So they're low affiliation, low dominance. If you think about someone who's not affiliative and not dominant, can you think of someone in your lives or in your clinical practice or someone in your family who's kind of like that? Right? So they might be what we call introverted, right? They're kind of not taking charge. They're sitting back. They don't really need to connect with other people. So that's one way to conceptualize these individual differences. Versus person B might be more affiliative. And person B might also be more dominant. So they're high affiliation, high dominance. When we think about that person, that's someone who wants to go out there and connect with people, and they take charge of the situation, and they really want to go meet every person in this room. They might just approach you. And we could say that person is highly extroverted. So here we have an introvert, and here we have an extrovert on the 2 dimensions. So we can label people on 2 dimensions. So why am I looking at these 2, and why am I going to suggest that we need to look at them together? Well, let's say we have person C, and person C is just as dominant as person B, right? But on affiliation, they're the exact opposite. So if we only looked at dominance, and we were only describing people we interact with on dominance, person A, or person B and person C would look exactly the same, right? But how would our interaction with them go? It'd be very different. So person B is very extroverted. They want to connect with you, and they're taking charge, while person C is low affiliation and high dominance. They're in charge, but they really don't feel a need to connect with you about that. They'll be happy just to tell you how they feel and not connect with you. So if we only look at one of these dimensions, then we won't understand how different that individual is. And certainly in our clinical experience of these individuals would be very different. And probably our approach to them would be very different as well. But if we only looked at affiliation, we'd only see how different they are, and we wouldn't realize the similarities they have in common. And so for any given situation, the similarities and differences might be important. So how do we keep track of this? Are we going to just keep track of 2 dimensions all the time? Well, if we look at these 2 dimensions, we know from research and statistically that they're completely independent of one another. But we also know that when we look at behaviors and we code behaviors, that these 2 dimensions have a very unique relationship in that the sum of the 2 parts is much more important. The sum of the 2 dimensions individually is not as important as understanding the whole. So we can orient them together. And this is called the interpersonal circle model, because if we look at the 2 dimensions and we say we're going to code them simultaneously, it kind of looks like a circle, right? So we can look at circular space. And how we do it is, if remember this person, person B, they were fairly affiliative, but they were very dominant. We can plot them out there. And we can start keeping track of individual differences in social behavior. And this can be used for traits. We use it for coding behaviors in psychotherapy. There's ways to code videotapes of behaviors in psychotherapy now with this. So remember person A, who is introverted? They're exactly the opposite, extroversion and introversion, and they're opposite on the circumflex. So we can easily see this. So this person's submissive and unaffiliated. Now, person C, up here, exact same amount of dominance, but very different unaffiliatedness. And then this person down here is what we might call agreeable. They're affiliative but submissive. And we can label the quadrants that way. So disagreeable, extroverted, introverted, and agreeable. And we can start to understand how these two dimensions are manifested. And we can start to understand ourselves, perhaps as clinicians, or friends, or family members. And we can also start to understand what's going on with the people we interact with. So we can also use this model to understand the interpersonal manifestations of different traits. So I was talking earlier, well, how do we know what impulsive aggression looks like? It could be dominant, it could be hostile, it could be both. There's a way for us to figure that out. And we can use this circle to see where is impulsivity on here. People who are highly impulsive. So I looked at this in two samples. These are both from the Collaborative Longitudinal Personality Disorder Study. That's what I did my postdoc on here at Yale. And there are two samples I used from that study. One were the 167 outpatients with borderline personality disorder diagnosis at baseline. And the other were the 92 outpatients that only had major depression. They did not have any personality disorder whatsoever. And in the individuals with borderline personality disorder, impulsivity and aggression were both significantly associated with being unaffiliated, being hostile. But in the patients with depression, only aggression was associated with low affiliation. Impulsivity wasn't related to any interpersonal impact. So this was kind of interesting. It kind of makes you start thinking, why is it only in BPD that impulsivity is associated with hostile social processes, but it's not with other individuals? I'd also like to point out, notice that dominance is not really in there. I'll show you on the circle, actually. So remember, this is the circle I just showed. Aggression, so it's slightly dominant, but it's very, very unaffiliated. Well, impulsivity is just unaffiliated. There's zero correlation with dominance. So it's all about the hostile processes. So if we have this finding here, are patients with BPD then characterized by a general interpersonal style of hostility or aggression? That was that second question I asked earlier. So is this their general interpersonal style? And that's how all these different symptoms are interrelated. And based on the location of impulsivity and aggression that we just found, we might suspect that all individuals with BPD would end up here if we plotted them on the interpersonal circumflex. Right? So because impulsivity and aggression are here, and only there in individuals with BPD, then maybe we would see everyone, when we plotted a sample of them, here. And then that would suggest that impulsivity and aggression and the interpersonal style of individuals with borderline personality disorder are all similar, and they all have one coherent impact. So where do individuals with BPD fall on the interpersonal circle? Using again the Collaborative Longitudinal Personality Study, participants who met for borderline personality disorder diagnosis at baseline, the study was a 10-year study, and looking at their self-reported interpersonal traits on dominance and affiliation. I was able to then map them on the interpersonal circle and see where they fell. So remember, we're expecting them to be on the far side of the circle, right, when they pop up. No, right? There's heterogeneity, as I like to say. They're all over the place. There's not one interpersonal style. They are not marked by a single interpersonal style. But then I was talking with people and they're like, yeah, but those clips. Maybe it's just clips. Maybe you need to look at another sample. So I turned to one of my colleagues. He's at Western Psychiatric Hospital. And he has an outpatient sample, 255 patients with borderline PD, traits or diagnosis. So he actually widened it a bit. Because people were saying, well, maybe it was something about how you diagnosed them. He diagnosed them in a completely different way. He included people that were one less than meaningful criteria. And he looked at a different measure. So he looked, do they report interpersonal problems? So maybe interpersonal traits are all varied in individuals with BPD, but maybe they all have the exact same type of interpersonal problems. And maybe those problems are all associated with hostility or dominance, right? Makes sense. So let's see. No, did not come out. Heterogeneity. They report interpersonal problems all over the place. There is not a single interpersonal style or interpersonal problem associated with the diagnosis. And these are large samples. So now we're starting to think, all right, so it's not a single interpersonal style or problem associated with disorder. We know that interpersonal functioning is key in these individuals, but it's not a singular type of key. What's going on? So interpersonal traits in BPD are varied. Is everyone with BPD hostile and or aggressive? In general, no. They do not have those traits. They do not manifest consistently that way. There's no single prototypical interpersonal style. People can be agreeable, extroverted, disagreeable, so agreeable, extroverted, disagreeable, introverted. They're all over the place. By the way, these individuals, if we go back to that study I mentioned earlier, we're looking at people that were at risk. These individuals here all had comorbid antisocial personality disorder. That's going to be key in a second. So given that they don't have an interpersonal style that's a single type of style, what is it interpersonally? Well, there's actually some research going on at McGill and with some collaborators of Debbie Moskowitz that is looking at interpersonal spin. So maybe it's that they aren't staying there. They're treated that way and they have problems that are just like this, but moment to moment, they vary, right? So that's a line of research I'm not going to go too much into today, but that variability, that movement in interpersonal style does seem to be related to impulsivity. So that might be key. More research. Remember I said earlier, more research is needed to determine which individual differences are associated with the outcomes. So maybe it's that if we look at that big group of individuals with BPD, a certain subset of them are associated with having more legal involvement. And if we look at these circles, we might think that it's the individuals that are over here, right? Those are the ones that are associated with impulsivity and aggression. So these individuals might be more at risk for getting involved with forensic settings or with legal involvement. And then that might be key when we have patients coming in that look more like this, that feel really much more hostile and cold and withdrawn to us. Maybe that's something that we need to be keeping in mind. And if you look at the literature, there's support for this possibility. And a very, very large sample of 1,000 inmates. Now, these are all male, so that is a caveat. That is a weakness to these findings. These researchers found that when measuring the affiliation and dominance of the interpersonal circle by self-report, and then also looking at staff ratings of treatment noncompliance in forensic settings, and institutional misconduct, which was defined as defiance or physical aggression while in there, they found that hostility was associated with more symptoms of BPD in forensic patients. And that high dominance and low affiliation, or hostility, were associated with the treatment noncompliance in disciplinary infractions. So perhaps it is those individuals on the left side of the circle that are not only at greater risk for being involved in forensic settings, but also for having difficulty in those forensic settings. So what is it about impulsivity and hostile social processes that are leading to this? Why might that put individuals at greater risk? So we looked to see what traits mediate the association between BPD and legal involvement over 10 years in CLIPS. And we asked whether it was dominance, hostility, low affiliation, or impulsivity that were associated with this, and looking at a mediation model, which I'll walk you through. We used CLIPS. We looked at their legal and criminal life events over the entire 10 years. And we also looked at trait impulsivity. So like we've been looking at, BPD symptoms associated with legal involvement. That's what the previous research suggests. And we looked at baseline BPD symptoms and 10 years of whether they were involved in legal proceedings. We found those very moderately correlated. But then we also looked at hostility and impulsivity. And we said, are BPD symptoms related to hostility and impulsivity? And in fact, they were. So are hostility and impulsivity then related to legal involvement? they were, significantly. And when we ran the model to test whether the effect between BPD symptoms and legal involvement remained, it did not. It was completely mediated by hostility and impulsivity. So BPD symptoms are associated with hostility and impulsivity, but they were also, and that entirely accounted for the legal involvement of those individuals. So maybe it's really the hostility and impulsivity that are the problems. And we've looked at this as a focus in clinical work on impulsivity, the neurobiology, interventions, pharmacotherapy we'll talk about today. But what is it about affiliation and hostility? And what are we doing to look at that? And what exactly, how is that manifested in individuals with BPD? How might hostility play a role? So if we go back and we look at what I said earlier about impulsive aggression, it's the perception of context and interpersonal interactions that are biased towards interpretations of threat and hostility. Oh, hostility came in early. Good. But is it the reactivity that is associated with the impulsive aggression? So I was saying it's a very reactive aggression. So is it the interpersonal reactivity that might be problematic or distinguishing individuals with BPD? Or is it misperceptions of threat, this bias that is leading to it? We know that the diagnosis is associated with interpersonal functioning, but how might the social perceptions and reactions contribute to some of these findings? And so I'm going to tell you really quick about some research of one of my colleagues. It was his dissertation, actually, and he never published it, so he's been kind enough to let me talk about it here. Chris Hopwood at Michigan State. For his dissertation, he took male-female dyads and had them interact in the lab. They did not know each other beforehand. And half of the dyads, the woman had a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. And the other half, the women did not. And they asked them, they interacted, they coded their interpersonal behaviors, and they asked them about the perception of their own behavior and the perception of others' behavior on the affiliation and dominance. So what did they find? They found that in terms of social misperception, so social misperception a primary issue? That was one of their hypotheses. And they found that with regards to affiliation, women with BPD demonstrated lower agreement with the informants, or the person they were interacting with, or people who observed the tape, about their warmth than women without BPD. But women on dominance, women with BPD, perceived others' behavior more similarly to the other than non-borderline women. Let me just explain shorthand what that means. So they misperceived on affiliation, but they were more accurate than the healthy controls on dominance. So they could really perceive very accurately dominant behavior, but they were really misperceiving affiliative behavior. So remember, hostility was where the impulsivity was. Hostility is what's associated with legal. So maybe it's something about hostility and not about the dominance. So then he looked at social reactivity and said, women with BPD on affiliation were more situationally reactive. So they moved around a lot more on affiliativeness than individuals without. And the men that were interacting with the women with BPD were also more reactive. So it was kind of the synchrony of reactivity that could then escalate. And if you think about this clinically or interacting with people, I'm sure we've all experienced this, where suddenly we're both out of control. We're not quite sure how we got here. And on dominance, there's no effect. So the implications are that the dysfunction of patients with BPD might be primarily on the hostile to affiliative dimensions of interpersonal behavior. So on affiliation, there was perceptual inaccuracy of interpersonal behavior and hyperreactivity of both parties. So it's a dyadic hyperreactivity. But on dominance, they accurately perceived the other's efforts to control or submit within the interaction. They were more accurate than everyone else. So it's not simply a social perception is off. It's a social perception when it comes to connection. That's key. So in conclusion, individuals with BPD are not characterized by a single interpersonal style. Remember, they're all over the interpersonal map. There's all kinds of individuals who have that diagnosis. But impulsivity and negative outcomes are associated with the less affiliative behavior. And so this might highlight the importance of hostility as a subgroup of individuals who we might need to focus more on. And impulsive aggression might be disrupting the interpersonal functioning, particularly in the context of perceived hostility or hostile social behavior. So remember that impulsive aggression, there was this suggestion that maybe the neurobiology of it is, or the neurocognitive processing of it is related to misperception. So maybe it's the misperception of affiliative behaviors. And maybe it's also social reactivity. So impulsive aggression, remember, was the reactivity in the moment, unplanned. So maybe that's also where the connection is with interpersonal dysfunction. And that might be related to emotion dysregulation. We know from some of the studies that look at actual behaviors over time in individuals with BPD that emotion dysregulation is related to more variability in interpersonal behavior. So that might really be the key aspect. In terms of treatment and interventions, perhaps we need to target hostility and social reactivity and social misperceptions as vulnerability factors in individuals with BPD. So individuals that meet the diagnosis are all over the interpersonal map, but particularly in certain clinical settings, we know that those with greater number of symptoms have greater hostile behavior. So there's association with that. So the most prototypical, or the most extreme cases, have hostile behaviors, and that might be promoting the dysfunction in those individuals. Perhaps we need to look at DBT and mentalization to see what aspects are there within those treatments and other treatments that might be addressing this misperception and affiliation. Or perhaps we need to develop treatment modules, treatment add-on modules that can target this more effectively. And perhaps consider the impact of hostile social processes in forensic settings. It suggests that hostile social processes are related to more negative outcomes. So how might we intervene in patients once they enter the forensic setting to decrease that likelihood? So I just want to say thank you to all my collaborators who provided excellent research and excellent thought in producing this, and also my participants.
Examples of a misperception of affiliation.
Sure. Sure, so a misperception of affiliation is, sorry, if I go back to my slides. All right, I'm going to fly through this, and I'm going to give you my favorite way to talk about this is going to be on the interpersonal journal. So a misperception of affiliative behavior might be if you have two, let's say you're in therapy, you're in psychotherapy. And let's say I'm a therapist and I have a patient with BPD, a diagnosis. And I believe I'm acting fairly affiliative. Maybe not overly affiliative, but fairly affiliative. And other people that are observing me would say, yeah, you're pretty accurate. You're behaving fairly affiliative. The research suggests that an individual with a BPD diagnosis might perceive me as being cold and unaffiliative, and then respond to the cold and unaffiliative behavior. There's other research that suggests that it's interpersonal complementarity, and it suggests that we will have a tendency and find it easier to respond in very similar ways on affiliativeness to one another. So if I was being affiliative, then the normative social behavior would be to respond in an equally affiliative way. But what we find with individuals with BPD is that they misperceive it. They might perceive it as less affiliative. Or maybe I am being less affiliative and saying, okay, we need to just back off, we need to back off. But perhaps they see that as more of an invitation. So those are misperceptions can go both ways. But given the way that the main effects are, I would say that most misperceptions are that I feel I'm being fairly affiliative, maybe not overly affiliative, and it's being perceived as unaffiliative.
If there are other questions, please raise your hand. Actually, if you've written them down, just kind of once in a while hold them up, send them to the aisles, and our volunteers will run them right over up this way. So I'll take the next one. If there's others, we'll be happy to take them. And the question is antisocial personality disorder the same thing as sociopathic? Is there treatment for comorbidity of antisocial personality disorder and borderline personality disorder?
All right, so there's two questions.
So two questions. The first one is it the same as sociopath?
is it sociopathic? Not necessarily. It's kind of two different. Antisocial personality disorder is a DSM construct that can have psychopathic qualities in it, but there's also some psychopathic qualities or individuals that meet for that would not qualify for antisocial personality disorder, and vice versa. So there's overlap. Now, in terms of treatment, there are no specific treatments that address the comorbidity that I'm aware of. Perhaps other individuals could speak to that. I think what we do have are treatments that are perhaps modified for settings, but I think that the research that has been done shows that when you have comorbid antisocial personality disorder, then you tend to have worse outcomes. So I don't know that we've really fully addressed that.
We've got a question. Could you explain the difference or define aggression versus impulsivity? Say a little bit more about that.
Okay. So aggression, I think there might be some people that disagree with how I might define aggression. So aggression we might think of as a very dominant behavior. There's different types of aggression. There's verbal aggression, there's behavioral aggression, there's perhaps emotional aggression, but it's a very hostile dominant behavior is how I'd probably describe it. I would have anticipated it to be fairly far out here, and I think that if you look at actual behavioral acts, they can get coded as being very hostile and very dominant. Impulsivity, there are also many definitions of impulsivity. There's motor impulsivity, there's cognitive impulsivity. It's a tendency to perhaps behaviorally act without forethought, without thinking through all the consequences. Perhaps a cognitive tendency to not think things completely through. So that's kind of just brief general definitions I would give of this.
And can you clarify the relation of the concepts of hostility and affiliation?
So hostility would be on the opposite side of affiliativeness. So it's just what I would consider almost a synonym for unaffiliatedness. When we look at some of the hostility measures that are out there that measure hostile traits, and we look at this interpersonal circumflex, they pretty much end up here maybe with a little bit of dominance in them, but they're all considered unaffiliative. So they're perhaps the opposite, the reciprocal end of the dimension of affiliativeness.
We got a question. Can you say a little bit more about the demographics of the subjects in the CLIPS research?
The demographics, yes, I only went over that briefly. So the CLIPS study is a multi-site collaborative study. One of the sites was here at Yale, of community and outpatients. So some of the individuals were seeking treatment at one of the sites. It was Yale, Harvard-McLean, Brown, and Columbia were the four different sites. And the individuals were brought into the study because they met one of 4 PDs for the major depression control group that I mentioned. And the 4 PDs were borderline personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder, obsessive-compulsive, or schizotypal personality disorders. The demographics, they were, I believe, the mean age at intake was around 33. There was a greater diversity of ethnic minorities than you would generally find in those particular locations, but still the majority of them were Caucasian. With regards to the BPD patients, there were more women than there were men. And that's probably a very important consideration because we also then see different gender demographics with regards to forensic settings. Oh, and we followed them every year for 10 years, so that's where a lot of that data came from.
The next question is, can you say how BPD compares to the general population of forensic settings, individuals with high dominance and low affiliation? How are BPD individuals, how do they compare with kind of general forensic
So the study, let me go ahead to this if I can. So that study that I presented on the traits, in general, showed that, this one, yes. So hostility was associated with BPD. So if they had BPD symptoms, then they were more hostile than the general population. And this was the 1,000 male inmates that underwent this assessment procedure. So they were not necessarily have psychiatric diagnoses. They were just being assessed as part of the admissions process for this study. So in general, BPD patients were more hostile than the general inmates in this study. And unfortunately, that's about the only research I know of with regards to those two dimensions. This is an all male.
Okay, and thank you very much, Dr. Emily Asler.